The glass hit the stone floor before I understood what I had done. No, that is not entirely true. I understood. I simply could not stop myself. One moment I was carrying a tray of crystal goblets across the great hall of Vordenmere Keep, navigating the narrow corridor between long tables packed with warriors, nobles, and the kind of men who wore their power like armor even when they were seated. The next, I heard the sharp crack of a chair scraping back too fast, a child's startled gasp, and the unmistakable whistle of something heavy cutting through the air. A goblet, knocked from the high table by a soldier's careless elbow, spinning in a long, lazy arc directly toward the small boy seated at the Alpha King's right hand. I moved before my mind gave permission. My body crossed the distance in 3 strides, and I threw myself between the falling object and the child, turning instinctively so that my back caught the impact. The tray I had been holding flew from my hands. Every goblet on it shattered across the stone floor in a cascading explosion of sound that silenced every conversation in the hall. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I was on one knee, breathing hard, both palms flat against the cold floor. My back throbbed where the crystal had struck. Not deeply, not terribly, but enough that I felt it radiating outward across my shoulder blade like a brand. Shards of glass glittered around me in the firelight like scattered stars. Slowly, I raised my head. The boy, Kalen, the Alpha King's son, 8 years old and currently wide-eyed with something between terror and fascination, was staring at me from inches away. He was unharmed. Not a scratch on his small face, not a flicker of pain anywhere in those pale eyes. He looked at me the way children look at things they cannot categorize, with his head slightly tilted, his lips parted, and a very specific kind of silence that meant he was working through something important. "Are you hurt?" he whispered. I wanted to say no. The word was ready. I have said no so many times in my life that it has worn a smooth groove in my throat, easy and automatic. But something about the directness of his question, no performance in it, no politics, just a child asking a child's honest thing, made me pause. "A little," I said instead. "But I'm fine." He nodded very seriously, as though I had given him exactly the right answer. Then I became aware of every other pair of eyes in the room. I had worked at Vordenmere Keep for 11 months. I had served at hundreds of these dinners, the weekly gathering of the Alpha King's inner council and their extended households, a ritual that had probably looked the same for 300 years. Long tables, torchlight, the smell of roasted meat and pine resin, and the particular musk that came from having too many dominant wolves in one enclosed space. I had learned very quickly, in my first week, how to be invisible, how to move along the walls, to keep my eyes at shoulder height rather than meeting anyone's gaze, to refill goblets without announcing myself and clear plates without disturbing conversation. An omega in this hall was furniture, useful, unremarkable, easily replaced. I had been very good at being furniture, until 30 seconds ago. The man at the head of the table had not moved. He sat exactly as he had been sitting when I first entered the hall, one arm resting along the back of his chair, his posture the specific kind of relaxed that is not actually relaxed at all, but is instead the perfect stillness of someone who has trained themselves not to telegraph their reactions. He was watching me with ice-blue eyes that caught the firelight and gave nothing back. Adrian Vordenmere, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. The man whose name was spoken in a different register than all other names, a half-step lower, the way you might speak the name of a storm system that had leveled 3 villages last winter. Not with fear exactly, but with a respect that has fear braided through it so thoroughly you cannot separate the 2 strands. He had dark braids pulled back from a face that was all clean angles and weathered deliberateness. A scar ran from just below his left eye toward his jaw. Not dramatic, not disfiguring, just a thin, pale line that said I have survived things in a language that needed no translation. He wore leather armor even at dinner, cross-strapped and worn in a way that suggested it was not costume, but habit. Beside him, the empty chair where his second, Commander Rowell, usually sat, was tonight occupied by a young woman I had not seen before. Dark-haired, sharp-featured, watching me now with an expression I could only describe as professionally annoyed. Adrian had not looked away from me since I stood. He said nothing. Around him, his council, 8 men and 2 women, each one a pack alpha or senior commander in their own right, were doing the thing powerful people do when something unexpected happens. They were watching him, reading his reaction before deciding how to have their own. Roel, seated 3 chairs down, leaned forward. He was a broad man with a red beard that he kept short, and eyes the color of wet bark. Quick eyes, observant. He had always been mildly decent to the serving staff, which made him an outlier in this room. "Someone clean this up," he said, and it was addressed to the room generally, but his gaze was on me specifically, not unkind, but clear. "Get up. Return to your work. Do not make this a moment." I was grateful for it. I pushed to my feet, careful to keep my expression neutral as the movement pulled at the impact point on my back. A few shards of crystal caught in the fabric of my dress. I could feel them shifting, small and pointed, which meant I would be picking glass out of my skin later. Nothing serious. I had worked in the kitchens of 4 different pack households since I was 16, and I had a fairly thorough understanding of what constituted serious. I crouched and began collecting the larger pieces of glass from the floor, moving carefully, keeping my gaze down. "Leave it." The voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that is actually very loud. The kind that comes from someone who almost never needs to raise their volume because the room has learned long ago to arrange itself around their words. I went still. "Look at me." I looked up. Adrian Vordenmere was watching me with the same unreadable expression he had worn since the moment everything broke. Up close. And somehow I realized he was closer than he had been before. Had moved from the head of the table to stand perhaps 6 feet from where I was crouched on the floor, moving with a silence that should have been impossible for a man that size. He was more overwhelming than he appeared from across the room, not in a theatrical way, in the way that very old forests are overwhelming, not because of any single tree, but because of the accumulated weight of everything that has lived and persisted there. "What is your name?" he asked. My mouth was dry. "Ivy," I said. "Ivy Solon. I'm one of the evening servers from the kitchen staff." He looked at me for a long moment. Then his gaze moved, deliberately, completely, to his son. Kalen had climbed down from his chair and was standing beside his father now, one small hand gripping the edge of Adrian's leather bracer without seeming to realize he was doing it. The grip of a child who had been frightened and was managing it by anchoring himself to the largest person in the room. Something passed over Adrian's face. It was fast, a single frame in a long film. But I caught it. He looked back at me. "You're dismissed for the evening," he said. "Have the healer look at your back." It was not a suggestion. I nodded, gathered myself, and left the hall as quietly as I could. Behind me, conversation slowly resumed. The careful, recalibrating conversation of people who had witnessed something they were not yet sure how to file. I did not look back, but as I reached the heavy oak door at the far end of the hall, the back of my neck prickled with the particular awareness of being watched. I knew without looking who it was, and I knew with equal certainty that tomorrow was going to be different from every other day I had spent trying to be invisible in this place. Word count, 1-512. Expanding to full count. The corridor outside the great hall smelled of tallow candles and old stone, a smell I had come to associate with the particular exhaustion of a long shift ending. I pressed my back against the wall once I was out of sight of the doors, just for a moment, letting the cool stone ground me. My heart was still moving too fast. 11 months. I had spent 11 months perfecting the art of passing through this keep-like weather. Noticed only when I was needed, forgotten the moment I was not. I was good at it. Being an Omega in a fortress full of dominant wolves required a very specific skill set, and near the top of the list was the ability to make yourself small enough that the room's natural hierarchy simply rolled over you without registering your presence. I had ruined that in 3 strides, in one instinctive, unthinking act of putting myself between a child and something sharp. Down the corridor, the healer's room glowed amber through its cracked door. I pushed it open. Marin, the keep's senior healer, was a woman in her late 50s, with cropped silver hair and the unhurried movements of someone who had been managing other people's emergencies for so long that she had stopped experiencing them as emergencies herself. She looked up when I entered, registered my expression and the way I was holding my shoulders, and simply pointed at the wooden stool in the center of the room. "Sit," she said. "Turn around. Tell me what happened." I sat. I turned. I told her. She was quiet for a moment as she worked, her fingers gentle and efficient. "You threw yourself over Kaelin Vordenmere," she said finally. Not a question. The goblet would have hit him. "Yes," she agreed. "It would have." A pause. The soft sound of glass fragments being set on the tray beside her. And how many of the 30 wolves in that hall moved to stop it? I did not answer because we both knew. None of them. Marin covered the small cuts with a salve that smelled of pine and something sharper, medicinal, efficient, and wrapped a soft cloth over my shoulder blade to hold it in place. Her hands rested briefly on my shoulders before she stepped back, and the touch was neither maternal nor performative, just steady. "Get some sleep, Ivy," she said. "I have a feeling tomorrow will ask more of you than today did." I walked back to the servants' quarters through the keep's lower corridors, past the kitchen where the night staff was still working, past the small room where the laundered linens were stored, smelling of lavender and lye. My room was at the far end of the east wing, small, stone-walled, with a single window that looked out over the training yard. I lay down on my narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Through the window, faint and distant, I could hear the keep settling into its nighttime rhythms. The change of the watch, the low conversation of the gate guards. Somewhere above me, in the family wing, a child's voice, brief, questioning, and then quiet. I closed my eyes. Sleep did not come quickly, and when it did, it was thin and restless, full of the echo of breaking glass and the particular weight of ice-blue eyes that had looked at me as though they were in the process of solving a problem they had not expected to encounter. I woke before the bells. This was not unusual. My body had developed the habit years ago, sometime during my second posting at a pack household, when the head cook had made it clear that arriving with the morning bell was the same as arriving late. The lesson had embedded itself so deeply that even now, on my one free morning each week, my eyes opened in the dark without being asked. I lay still for a moment, cataloging the feeling in my back. Stiff. Tender in a concentrated point just below my left shoulder blade, radiating outward when I shifted. Nothing that would stop me from working. I had learned early that the threshold for unable to work was considerably higher than most people in comfortable positions imagined, and I had learned to calibrate myself against it honestly rather than generously. I dressed in the dark, rebraided my pale hair. It had come loose in the night, spilling across the pillow in the way it always did, fine and light-colored enough that it caught even dim light, and pulled on my apron. The kitchen was already warm when I arrived. Petra, the head cook, was a wide woman with forearms like bread loaves, and a voice she used the way a mason uses a hammer, with precision, without waste. She looked up when I entered, and something crossed her face that I could not immediately name. "You're on light duty today," she said. I stopped. "I'm fine." "I know you are." She turned back to the pot she was stirring. "Light duty." This was how Petra communicated that something had happened above her level of authority, and filtered down to her level as instruction. She did not elaborate because she did not know the details, or because she did not feel it was her place to share them, and either way the result was the same. I would spend the morning doing tasks that kept me out of the Great Hall, out of sight, and, I suspected, available if someone in the upper levels of the keep decided to send for me. I spent the first 2 hours sorting linens. It was quiet work, repetitive and grounding, and it gave me too much time to think. What I thought about, despite my best efforts to redirect myself, was the moment Adrian Vordenmere had stood from his chair. I had not seen him move. That was the thing that kept returning to me, catching on the edge of my thoughts like fabric on a nail. One moment he had been at the head of the table, watching me from a distance. The next, he was 6 feet away, standing with the total stillness of something that had arrived rather than traveled. I had been crouching on the floor, collecting glass, and when I looked up, he had simply been there, close enough that I could see the texture of the leather straps across his chest, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw was set not with anger, but with the particular quality of attention that is more unsettling than anger, because it means someone is genuinely processing you rather than reacting to you. "What is your name?" 3 words. He could have said nothing. Most of the alphas I had served under over the years would have said nothing, would have nodded at someone to handle the situation, returned to their food, filed the incident under staff matter, resolved. I had built my entire professional existence around the assumption that I was not interesting enough to warrant directed speech from anyone above the rank of head steward. I folded a sheet with perhaps more force than necessary and set it on the pile. "Ivy Solin." I turned so fast I nearly knocked the linen shelf over. The man in the doorway was not Adrian. He was younger, perhaps 30, lean where the Alpha King was broad, with the wiry, alert quality of someone whose value lay in being faster than everyone around them rather than stronger. Brown eyes, quick and assessing. He was dressed in the dark uniform of the King's personal guard, which meant he reported to no one in the keep except Adrian himself. "That's me," I said. "The King requests your presence." He said it simply, without ceremony, but also without any of the dismissiveness that the personal guard sometimes used when summoning staff. Just a statement of fact. My stomach dropped approximately 4 inches. "Now?" "When you're ready," which meant now. The King's study was on the 3rd floor of the keep's main tower, a room I had never entered and had only seen from the outside, its tall windows overlooking both the training yard and the eastern approach to the gates. I had sometimes caught the amber glow of lamplight there in the late evenings, long after most of the household had retired, and had privately catalogued it as the room of a man who did not sleep easily. The guard, he told me his name was Dane, volunteering it without being asked, which I found unexpectedly humanizing, led me up 2 flights of stone stairs and knocked twice on a heavy door before opening it and stepping aside. "Go ahead," he said. I went. The room smelled of parchment and pine resin, and something darker underneath. Cedar, perhaps, or the particular dry, cold smell of stone that has been in shadow for centuries. Maps covered one entire wall, pinned and annotated in a hand that pressed hard enough to dent the parchment. The desk was buried in papers, but not chaotically. There was a system to it, a density of organization that only looked like disorder until you understood the person who had made it. Books were stacked on every horizontal surface, many of them open, many of them marked with strips of leather. Adrian was standing at the window. He turned when I entered, and for the second time in less than 24 hours, I had the experience of being looked at rather than looked past. "Close the door," he said. I did. He studied me for a moment in the morning light, which was kinder than torchlight and no less revealing. He looked, I thought, like a man who had been awake for most of the night. Not ragged, not undone, but carrying the particular density of someone who had been thinking for many consecutive hours and had arrived somewhere he had not entirely planned on arriving. "How is your back?" he asked. "Better," I said. Marin was thorough. He nodded. A pause. He moved from the window to the desk, picked up a piece of parchment, set it down again. Not reading it, just the habitual gesture of a man who thought more clearly with something in his hands. "Sit down," he said, nodding toward the chairs near the empty hearth. I sat on the edge of the nearest one, spine straight, hands in my lap. The posture of someone who has spent years being called into rooms by people with authority, and has learned that looking composed is not the same as feeling it, but it is considerably more useful. He did not sit. He stood near the desk, one hand resting on its surface, and looked at me with that same quality of undivided attention. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Not your work history. You." I blinked. Of all the sentences I had prepared myself to receive in this room, That was not among them. I'm not sure what you mean, I said carefully. Where are you from? Selmore originally. Small settlement, Eastern Pack territory. My family, my parents, passed when I was 14. I've worked in pack households since I was 16. Alone since 14. Yes. He absorbed this without visible reaction. You've worked in 4 households before this one, all of them alpha ranked. He had looked into me. The realization arrived quietly, without drama, but it reorganized something in the room. That's correct, I said. Why did you leave them? This was the question I had answered in my own mind many times, in several different framings, and had never been asked directly by anyone with the authority to pursue the answer beyond the surface. I chose honesty, because I had the sense that anything else would be immediately visible to him. The first posting ended when the alpha's wife decided she preferred staff she had chosen herself. The second, the alpha was acquiring too much interest in omega workers that went beyond the professional. I left before it became a conflict. The third household dissolved when the pack fractured over a succession dispute. The fourth. I paused. The fourth, I left because I was asked to do something I wasn't willing to do. What were you asked to do? I met his eyes. Carry a message that I knew would be used to arrange harm to someone who didn't deserve it. I refused. I was dismissed the same evening. Silence. He looked at me steadily. You gave up a secure posting rather than carry a message. Yes. That's not a practical calculation. No, I agreed. It isn't. Something shifted in his expression, nearly imperceptible, but present. A reassessment, perhaps, or a confirmation of one. He moved from the desk to the chair across from mine, and finally sat, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees, a posture that was somehow less formal than standing had been, and for that reason more disarming. This close, I could see that the scar below his eye was older than it looked from a distance. Years old, fully healed, worn into his face with the same naturalness as everything else about him. Kalen doesn't respond well to the staff, he said. He tolerates them. He's polite, because I've raised him to be polite. But he doesn't trust easily, and since his mother... He stopped. A clean stop, not emotional. Just the deliberate closing of a door. He keeps most people at a distance. I waited. Last night, after you left, he asked me 3 separate times whether you had been properly looked after. He said this as though reporting a fact that had surprised him. Not the content of it, but the frequency. Kalen does not ask about staff. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. I want to offer you a different position, Adrian said. Not in the kitchens, closer to the household. Something between a personal attendant and a companion for Kalen, in the practical sense, present during his lessons, his meals, his afternoons. He paused again, and I had the sense that this word cost him something. Consistency, from someone who doesn't flinch. The word flinch landed with weight, and I understood it to be doing several kinds of work at once. I want to be honest with you, I said. I'm an Omega. Your council will have opinions about that. My council has opinions about everything, Adrian said. That is what I pay them for. It doesn't govern my household decisions. I looked at him. Really looked. For the first time without the pressure of performance, or the instinct to deflect. He was watching me with the same steadiness he had maintained throughout the conversation, and I understood that this was simply how he existed in the world, without the restlessness that most dominant wolves carried, the constant low-frequency assertion of hierarchy that filled every room they occupied. He was utterly still, and the stillness was not absence. It was weight. All right, I said. All right, you accept? All right, I accept. He nodded once, stood, and moved back to the desk. The conversation was over, not dismissed, but concluded, with the clean finality of a man who does not linger in decisions once they are made. I stood, moved toward the door, and paused with my hand on the frame. "The boy," I said. "Kalen. What does he like?" Adrian looked up from the desk. The question seemed to catch him off guard, in a way that nothing else in the conversation had. A small, unguarded moment. There and gone. "Maps," he said at last. "He likes maps." I nodded and left. Behind me, through the heavy door, I heard something I had not expected. The sound of a chair settling, as though a man had sat back in it for the first time in a long while. 3 weeks passed before I understood what I had walked into. Not the role itself, that revealed itself quickly, in the practical, unglamorous way that most real things do. Kalen's lessons ran from early morning until midday. History, mathematics, cartography, and the political geography of the Northern Territories, taught by a rotating cast of tutors who ranged from genuinely gifted to technically competent and personally insufferable. My job in those hours was not to teach, but to be present, to sit near the window with mending or with one of the books from the study's lower shelves, close enough that the room felt inhabited but not so close that I disrupted the work. To notice when Kalen's attention was fraying before the tutor did. To ask for water or a brief recess with enough naturalness that neither the tutor's dignity nor the boy's concentration was damaged in the process. In the afternoons, I was his entirely. This was the part that surprised me. Kalen was not a difficult child in the way I had half expected, not sullen or demanding or performing the small tyrannies that children of powerful households sometimes develop as their primary language. He was quiet in the way that certain very old souls are quiet. Observant first, verbal second, and startlingly direct when he did choose to speak. He asked questions without preamble. He sat with silences longer than most adults could tolerate. He had an extraordinary memory for geographic detail, and a complete indifference to the political maneuvering that filled most of the conversations he was forced to observe. On the 4th day, he spread a map of the Eastern Territories across the floor of the small sitting room that had been assigned to us, lay on his stomach with his chin in his hands, and said, "There's a mistake here." I came to look. He was pointing at the boundary line between 2 mid-range pack territories, a line that curved where, according to the older maps I had seen framed in the study's upper corridor, it had once been straight. "The Ashen River changed course about 40 years ago," he said, "after the thaw. The boundary should have been redrawn then, but it wasn't because Lord Casson and Lord Veth were already in a dispute about the grazing lands to the north, and nobody wanted to add another conflict." He looked up at me. "My father told me. He said that's how most wars start, not with the thing they're called after, but with the thing before that nobody resolved." I looked at him for a moment. "How old are you?" I asked. 8, he said, with the patience of someone who has had this reaction before. "Right," I said, and sat down on the floor beside him. That was the afternoon I understood that my primary job was not to manage Kalen. It was to keep up with him. What I had not yet understood in those first weeks was the architecture of tension that held the keep together. I began to see it in pieces. The woman who had sat beside Adrian at the council dinner, the dark-haired, sharp-featured one, was named Seren. She was the alpha of the Dunmore Pack, one of the 6 pack territories that owed military alliance to the Northern Crown, and she visited the keep with a frequency that went slightly beyond what political alliance strictly required. She was 29, controlled, beautiful in the precise way of someone who has always understood their appearance as a tactical resource, and she regarded me, from our very first direct encounter, with a quality of attention that was not quite hostility, but was several degrees colder than indifference. We met formally in the main corridor on my 5th day in the new role. She was walking with 2 of her own attendants, and she stopped when she saw me. Actually stopped, and looked at me the way you look at something that has appeared in a place you expected to be empty. "You're the girl from the hall," she said. It was not a question. "Ivy Solon," I said. "I've been assigned to... I know what you've been assigned to." She studied me for a moment with those careful, measuring eyes. "You should understand that this household has structures that have taken years to establish." Kaylin's care has been managed by senior staff for the past 3 years. There are people here who have invested considerably in their positions. I understand that, I said. Good. She held my gaze 1 beat longer than was comfortable, then moved past me without further comment, her attendants falling into step behind her. I stood in the corridor after she had gone, processing the specific temperature of what had just happened. It had not been a threat precisely. It had been a map. A careful, clearly drawn map of the territory I had stepped into, offered not out of kindness, but because the woman who had drawn it wanted me to see exactly how exposed my position was. I filed it. I kept moving. Roll found me in the library 3 days later. I had developed the habit of spending the hour after Kaylin's bedtime in the Keep's lower library, a room that was less impressive than the study, but considerably more comfortable, with wide chairs and shelves that had been allowed to develop character over generations of unsupervised reading. I was working through a history of the Northern Territory's border disputes, partly out of genuine interest, and partly because understanding the political geography seemed increasingly relevant to understanding the household I was living in. He knocked on the open door before entering, which I noted. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. "It's your keep," I said. "Technically, it's his." He settled into the chair across from mine with the comfort of a man who has spent considerable time in this room, stretched his legs out, and looked at the spine of the book in my hands. Border history. Efficient. "The boy is interested in maps," I said. "I thought I should understand what the maps are describing." Roll looked at me with those quick, bark-colored eyes. "How are you finding it, honestly?" I considered him. Roll's position in the Keep was difficult to fully diagram. He was Adrian's second in military command, had been so for 12 years, and occupied the particular zone of authority that comes from being both indispensable and genuinely trusted, which is rarer than people assume. He was also, I had observed, one of the only people in the Keep who spoke to Adrian as though they had the same number of teeth. "It's good," I said honestly. He's more than I expected." "He is," Roll agreed. There was warmth in it, unperformed. "He's been different this week, lighter," I noticed. I did not know how to respond to that without it becoming something weighted, so I turned a page. "Seren spoke to you," Roll said. I looked up. "I'm not asking." I saw it. He turned his cup. He had brought tea, I realized, 2 cups, one of which was sitting on the table beside me that I had not noticed him place there, in his hands. "She's not a bad person, Ivy. I want to say that first because context matters. She's intelligent, and she's an effective alpha, and she has genuine care for this territory. But she has also spent the better part of 2 years positioning herself very deliberately for something she wants. And your presence complicates that positioning in ways she did not anticipate." "I carried a tray," I said. "I have no positioning." "That," Roel said, with a slight smile that disappeared quickly, "is exactly the kind of thing that people without positioning say, right before they become very significant to the story." He stood, nodded at the tea, and left me with the book and the quiet and the particular unsettled feeling of having been told something important by someone who had said it kindly enough that I could not quite decide whether to be grateful or alarmed. The first time I saw Adrian after the study meeting was at Kaylin's afternoon lesson on the 12th day. He appeared in the doorway of the sitting room without announcement, still in his armor from what had clearly been a long morning. The buckles on his bracers were undone, which I had learned was a specific marker of exhaustion in a man who was meticulous about everything else. Kaylin looked up from the map we were annotating together and, with the instinct of a child who is calibrated to his parents' moods with years of careful observation, simply shifted slightly to make room without breaking the line of our work. Adrian came in. He stood behind us for a moment, looking at the map, and then he lowered himself into the chair at the edge of the table, the chair that was technically too small for him, which he occupied anyway with the unself-conscious adaptability of someone who has spent years fitting himself into spaces designed for other purposes. "What are you working on?" he asked. "The Ashen River correction," Kaylin said. "Ivy found the original survey records in the lower library." The actual bend in the river is 11 degrees further north than the current maps show. Adrian looked at me. I felt the look the way you feel a change in air pressure. You found the original surveys, he said. They were misfiled under agricultural records, I said, probably from the same period when the boundary dispute made everyone want to pretend the river hadn't moved. A silence. And then, brief, genuine, startling in its rarity, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, perhaps. The suggestion that somewhere behind the architecture of his composure, something had responded. That, he said, to no one in particular, is actually exactly right. Kaelin beamed at the map as though it had personally done something impressive. I looked back at the parchment in front of me and tried to arrange my thoughts into their proper order, which was harder than it should have been. That evening, after Kaelin was asleep, and I had made my way back through the keep's quiet corridors toward my room, I passed the study. The amber light was on beneath the door, as it almost always was. I did not stop. I had no reason to stop. But I slowed, just briefly, just for a moment, that I would not have been able to explain to anyone who had asked. Drawn by something I could not name, some frequency of stillness on the other side of that door that resonated with something in me I had not known was capable of resonating. I kept walking. But for the first time in 11 months in this keep, the distance between my room and the study felt like a thing I was aware of. A specific, measurable distance, with weight and direction. That, I understood, was the beginning of something I had not planned for. And the most dangerous things in my experience were always the ones you did not plan for. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, the way most trouble does, quietly, dressed as something ordinary. I had been in my new role for 6 weeks when the council convened for what Rowell described, with deliberate understatement, as a routine territorial review. I knew it was not routine, because Petra made 3 times the usual quantity of food that morning, because Dane and the personal guard rotated their shifts to maintain a constant presence at every entrance to the main hall, and because Kaelin, who was more atmospherically sensitive than anyone in the keep seemed to fully appreciate, spent the entire morning lesson pressing his stylus against the same point on his parchment, making a small dent that got deeper with every rotation of the hour. "It will be fine," I said, at the 3rd hour, without looking up from my book. He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know?" "I don't," I said, but I found that saying it out loud with enough conviction tends to make the waiting easier. He considered this. "That's not entirely rational." "No," I agreed. "Very little of what actually helps is." He went back to his work, and the dent in the parchment did not get any deeper. The council that day was attended by 11 alphas from across the Northern Territories, 6 of whom had traveled more than 3 days to be present. I knew this because I was, by this point, well enough embedded in the household's rhythms to understand the information that moved through the servants' corridors like water through stone. Not gossip, exactly, but the practical intelligence of people who are responsible for feeding, housing, and otherwise sustaining the infrastructure of power, and therefore know its shape intimately. What I knew, by midday, was this. 2 of the attending alphas had brought a formal proposal. They wanted a political alliance sealed not through the usual territorial agreements and resource pledges, but through a marriage contract. Specifically, a marriage between Adrian Vordenmere and Saren of Dunmore, to be announced before the full council, to take effect within the season. I heard this from Marin, who heard it from the head steward, who had been briefed so that the household could begin appropriate preparations. I sat with the information for a long time after Marin left. It was not my business. I was very clear with myself about that. Adrian Vordenmere's political arrangements were 17 layers above my station, belonged to a world that operated by rules I had never been invited to participate in, and had precisely nothing to do with me or my work or any reasonable interpretation of my life in this keep. I went back to the sitting room, where Kaelin was now lying on his stomach with a different map. This one of the sea territories to the north, which he had recently become interested in, and I sat in my chair and opened my book. I read the same paragraph 4 times. The council ran through the afternoon and into the evening. I served Kaylin his dinner in the sitting room rather than the great hall, a practical decision given the noise level below, and after he was asleep, I sat in the dim corridor outside his room in the particular way that I had developed over weeks, close enough to hear if he stirred, far enough to have my own thoughts. The keep hummed around me. Voices from the lower hall muffled through stone, the sound of boots on the main staircase, the wind off the eastern ridge pressing at the shuttered windows in long, slow pulses. The staircase door opened. Adrian came up it alone, without Dane, without any of the guard rotation, which meant he had come up the back way, the older staircase that the household staff used, the one that was narrow enough that two people could not pass each other without turning sideways. He was still in his formal leathers from the council, but the fur-lined outer cloak was gone, and his expression carried the specific compressed quality of a man who had spent many hours in a room full of people pulling at him from multiple directions, and had emerged still standing, but not unchanged. He stopped when he saw me. I stood, automatically. "Kaylin is asleep," I said. "He ate well. The lesson this morning went—" "I know," he said. "Dane told me." A pause. He did not move toward the boy's room, and he did not move away. He stood in the corridor with the low lamplight catching the angles of his face, and he looked at me in the way that had become, over 6 weeks, the thing I was most carefully not thinking about. "Were you waiting up?" "Habit," I said. "From which posting?" The question surprised me, that he had remembered what I had told him, the specifics of it, filed and retrievable. "The third," I said, "the pack that fractured. There were nights when no one knew exactly where the fault lines were going to run, and it seemed better to be awake." He was quiet for a moment. The wind pressed at the window at the end of the corridor. "The council made a formal proposal today," he said. "I heard." He looked at me steadily. "And?" I chose my words with care, because the question was doing more work than its single syllable suggested. "It's a strong political match," I said. "Dunmore's territory closes the gap in the northeastern border. Seren is capable and her pack is loyal. The council's reasoning is sound." "That's an analysis," he said. "I didn't ask for an analysis." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere below, a door closed. "I'm not sure it's my place to offer anything else," I said. He held my gaze for a long moment, longer than was comfortable, longer than the conversation strictly required. Then he nodded. Once, in the way that meant the subject was being set aside rather than resolved, and moved past me to check on his son. I stood in the corridor until I heard the soft sound of his footsteps returning, and then I walked, very deliberately, back toward the east wing. The confrontation with Seren came 4 days later, and it came, as these things often do, at the worst possible time. I was crossing the upper courtyard in the early afternoon, returning from the lower library with 2 new survey maps I had found for Kaylin, when Seren stepped out of the archway ahead of me with the timing of someone who had been waiting, specifically for this moment. She was not alone. 2 of her senior pack members flanked her, men who wore the easy confidence of wolves who have never had to question their place in any room. The courtyard was otherwise empty. "Ivy Solon," she said. "I've been wanting to speak with you properly." I stopped. I held the maps against my chest, and I met her eyes. "Lady Seren." She studied me for a moment, and I saw in her expression something I had not quite seen before. Not the cool, tactical assessment from our first meeting, but something with more heat in it. Something that had been sitting with its own weight for longer than she had probably intended. "You're clever," she said. "I want to acknowledge that. What you've done here, the way you've positioned yourself with the boy, made yourself indispensable, created proximity where there was none. That's not accidental." "I carry maps and sit through lessons," I said. "There's no strategy to it." "There is always strategy," she said, "even when the strategist isn't conscious of it." She took a step forward. "I am going to be very honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve the careful version." Adrian is not free to follow instinct. He is a king, and kings belong to their territories before they belong to themselves. Whatever you think you have seen in him, whatever you believe you have felt, it is not a door. It is a wall. And I am telling you this not to be cruel, but because I have watched 3 women in the past 2 years believe otherwise and leave this keep diminished. The silence afterward was the kind that has shape. I looked at her, and I thought about what Roel had said. She is not a bad person. I believed it still. What I was looking at was not cruelty. It was a woman who had wanted something for a very long time, who had built careful structures around that wanting, and who had walked into this courtyard not entirely because she was confident, but partly because she was afraid. That was the most human thing about her, and it made the whole conversation hurt in a different way than it might have. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," I said. "I came here to work. I'm still just working." She held my gaze for a long, measuring moment. Then she stepped aside. I walked past her and through the archway, and I did not look back. And I did not let my hands shake until I was in the corridor on the other side where no one could see them. That evening, Kaylin unrolled the northern sea map on the floor of the sitting room and pointed to a small, unmarked island, approximately 60 miles off the coast. "What do you think is there?" he asked. I sat down beside him. My hands were steady again. "I don't know," I said. "That's the interesting part." He nodded, satisfied with this answer, and began to draw a careful, speculative outline of what a harbor on the island's eastern shore might look like. His lines were precise for an 8-year-old. Everything about him was more precise than his age suggested, and I had stopped being surprised by it, and started simply being grateful for it. Grateful for the specific way that sitting beside him in these quiet afternoons made the rest of the keep's turbulence feel temporarily smaller than the clean scratch of a stylus on parchment. "Ivy," he said without looking up. "Yes. Are you going to leave?" I went still. "Why do you ask that?" He was quiet for a moment, still drawing. "People leave," he said simply, not with self-pity, just as a recorded fact, observed and filed. "Staff, mostly, but other people too." A pause. I wondered. I looked at the side of his face, the concentration there, the careful neutrality that was doing a great deal of work. "I'm not planning to leave," I said. "Plans change," he said. "They do," I agreed. "But right now, in this moment, I am sitting on this floor with this map, and I am not going anywhere." He looked up at me then, just briefly, just for a second, with an expression I had seen once before, in the Great Hall, the night everything broke. A child working through something important and arriving cautiously at something that might be called relief. He went back to his harbor. I stayed on the floor beside him, and outside the window the wind moved across the training yard in long, slow sweeps, and the amber light held us both in its particular quiet warmth. But later, when I lay awake in the narrow bed in the east wing, what I kept returning to was not Seren's words in the courtyard, not the council proposal, not even the careful expression of a boy who had learned too early that people leave. It was the question Adrian had asked me in the corridor, and one word, barely a word at all, but it had asked me something that no one in any pack household, in 11 years of careful invisibility, had ever thought to ask. Not what I analyzed, not what I reported, not what I could provide. What I felt. I pressed my palm flat against the cold wall beside my bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The distance between the east wing and the study tower felt, tonight, like a thing I could measure in heartbeats. The storm came in from the northern ridge on a Thursday, the way the worst ones always did, without the gradual buildup that gives you time to prepare. Just a sudden drop in pressure, and then the sky turning the specific greenish-gray that the older servants said meant, get inside and stay there. By mid-morning, the courtyard was empty, and the keep had folded itself inward. Shutters latched, fires rebuilt in every hearth, the household moving through its indoor routines with the slightly compressed energy of people who have accepted a temporary boundary on their world. I was in the sitting room with Kaylin when Dane came to the door. His expression told me before his words did. "There's been an incident at the eastern gate," he said. "Two of the visiting pack retinues, Aldrath and Cassin. Their men got into it in the lower courtyard. It escalated." He looked at me directly. "The king is managing it. He asked that Kaelin stay in this wing until it's resolved." Kaelin had gone very still beside me. Not frightened, or not only frightened, but listening with the whole body attention of a child who has learned that stillness is the best way to gather information when adults are being careful about what they say aloud. "We'll stay here," I said to Dane. "How serious?" "Contained," he said, "but it needs his full attention." He left. I turned to Kaelin. He was looking at the door with an expression I recognized, the particular weight of a child who is old enough to understand that something is wrong, but young enough to still need someone to tell him it will be all right, and wise enough to know that the telling only matters if the person saying it believes it. "Come here," I said. I spread the northern sea map across the floor between us, the one with his speculative harbor. Now several weeks more detailed, the coastline annotated in his small, precise hand with notes about tides and depths that he had researched from the library's sailing records. I sat cross-legged beside it and picked up a stylus. "Show me the harbor again," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he sat down, picked up his own stylus, and began to explain the breakwater design he had been developing for the past week. We stayed on that floor for 2 hours, while the storm pressed at the shutters, and the sounds from the lower levels of the keep filtered up to us as something distant and manageable. He talked about harbor engineering. I asked questions, genuine ones, because by this point the genuine questions came easily. He had made me interested in things I had never thought to be interested in, which was the particular gift of spending time with someone whose curiosity was completely unperformed. At the second hour, the door opened without a knock. Adrian came in. He was not in his formal leathers. He was in the working clothes I had only seen him in once before, darker, plainer, without the straps and buckles of the armor. And there was a cut along the back of his left hand that had been wrapped quickly, and not very well, the cloth already dark at the edges. He looked at Kaelin first, a single, sweeping assessment, and whatever he found there settled something in his shoulders. Then he looked at me. "Is it resolved?" I asked. "For now." He came into the room properly, closing the door behind him, and lowered himself into the chair at the edge of the table. His chair, the one that was too small, the one he had claimed on the 12th day without ceremony. He rested his wrapped hand on the table and looked at the map between us, with the expression of a man arriving somewhere that feels, against all reasonable expectation, like rest. "Aldrath and Cassin have been building toward this for 8 months, he said, not to me specifically, but not excluding me either. The river boundary, it was always going to come to a head. The Ashen River, Kaelin said, without looking up from his harbor. Adrian looked at his son. Then he looked at me. I met his eyes. Something passed between us in that look. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could have been named or pointed to, but something real. An acknowledgement. The particular recognition of two people who have been circling a truth for long enough that the circling itself has become a form of conversation. "The council proposal," he said, quietly enough that it was directed at me alone. Kaelin was absorbed in his drawing. The storm moved against the shutters. "Adrian, I told them no." He said it simply, without drama, in the same tone he used for everything that was true and settled. "This morning, before the incident, I told them the answer was no." I was very still. "It was a sound political argument," he said. "You were right about that. Everything you said was correct. Dunmore's territory, the northeastern border, Seren's capability, all of it accurate." He paused. "It was also the wrong answer, and I have spent 6 weeks understanding why." "You shouldn't," I started. "I have spent 6 weeks," he said again, steadier. "Watching you sit on that floor with my son and make him feel like the world is something he can understand and navigate, rather than something that will eventually require him to become someone smaller to survive in it. I have spent 6 weeks watching you refuse to be managed, refuse to disappear, refuse to carry messages you don't believe in, even when the cost is real." He looked at his wrapped hand, then back at me. "And I have spent 6 weeks asking myself what kind of king refuses to recognize the most honest thing in his own house." The room was very quiet. Kaylin had stopped drawing. I looked at the boy, who was looking at his map with the elaborate concentration of someone who is absolutely listening to every word and has decided with considerable wisdom that the correct strategy is to appear otherwise. "Kaylin," I said. He said, not looking up. "What do you think about the breakwater design?" He looked up then, and his expression was the most transparent I had ever seen it. Undisguised, unguarded, bright with something that was not quite a smile but was the emotional architecture that smiles are built on. "I think it needs a lighthouse," he said, "on the eastern point." "Draw it," I said. He went back to the map. I looked at Adrian. He was watching me with the same stillness he had always carried. But underneath it now, there was something I had not seen there before. Not vulnerability exactly, but openness. The expression of a man who has made a decision and is no longer holding the door shut. "I don't know how to do this," I said honestly. "I've spent 11 years learning how to be invisible in rooms like this. I don't have a position or a rank or anything that the council will recognize as—" "I'm not asking the council," he said. "I'm asking you." The storm outside made a sound like something settling. The fire crackled. Kaylin's stylus moved across parchment with its small, precise scratch. "All right," I said. It was the same word I had used in the study 6 weeks ago, when he had offered me a different kind of life than the one I had been living. I had not known, then, how many directions that word would open. I was beginning to understand now. What followed was not simple, and I will not pretend that it was. Seren left the keep 2 days after the storm, with her retinue and her careful composure intact. She and I did not speak again before she went, but as she crossed the main courtyard toward the gate, she paused, briefly, and looked back at me where I stood on the steps. The look was not warm, but it was not hostile either. It was the look of a woman who has reassessed a situation and made peace, privately, with the reassessment. She nodded once. I nodded back. The council objected, as councils do, loudly, systematically, with documented precedents and hierarchical concerns and the specific energy of institutions that have been comfortable for a long time and are being asked to grow. Adrian listened to all of it with his particular quality of patient, immovable attention. And when they had finished, he told them, without raising his voice, that the Northern Territories had survived 3 centuries, not because its kings had made politically convenient choices, but because they had made honest ones, and that he intended to continue the tradition. Roel, I was told, had smiled for approximately 4 seconds, and then arranged his face back into professional neutrality, which for Roel constituted a significant emotional display. Maren simply said, "When I found her in the healer's room the morning after, I told you." She had. I was beginning to think she told everyone things they needed to hear, slightly before they were ready to hear them, and had the grace not to make much of it afterward. The formal recognition came in early spring, when the snow on the eastern ridge had pulled back enough to show the dark rock underneath, and the training yard was muddy with snowmelt. It was not a grand ceremony. Adrian had never been a man for performance, and the household had learned, over the months, that the things that mattered most in his world happened quietly, in rooms without audiences, in the particular language of people who have decided to be honest with each other. But there was a moment, in the great hall, on an ordinary evening, not a council dinner, just the household at their tables, the fire at full roar, the smell of wood smoke and cooked meat, and the particular living warmth of a place that has people in it who know each other. When Adrian sat down at the head of the table and looked down its length to where I was sitting with Kaylin, who was explaining the lighthouse design to Roel, with the patient authority of someone who has thought about this considerably more than you have. Adrian looked at me across the full length of that table, across all that warmth and noise and ordinary life, and he held out his hand. Not a gesture with political meaning. Not a signal to the room. Just a man, at the end of a long table in his own house, extending his hand to a woman he trusted. I stood. I walked the length of the table. I took his hand. Kalen, without pausing his explanation of the lighthouse's structural integrity to Roel, reached across with his other hand and covered both of ours for a single, brief moment. The gesture of a boy who had learned to love carefully and was choosing, with everything he had, to keep choosing it. Then he went back to the lighthouse. Roel turned to the person beside him and said something quietly, and there was a murmur of sound along the table that was neither shocked nor dramatic, but simply warm. The sound of a household that had been watching something build for long enough that its arrival felt less like a surprise than a recognition. I sat beside Adrian. The fire burned. Outside, the first real thaw was loosening the ground along the eastern ridge, water moving under the last of the ice in small, persistent channels, working toward the river, working toward the sea. Somewhere on a map in the sitting room above us, a lighthouse stood on an eastern point, overlooking a harbor that did not yet exist, drawn in a small and precise hand by a boy who believed, with all the deep and unshakable conviction of someone who has chosen to trust the world again, that the unknown coast was worth sailing toward. That was where the story settled. Not in a throne room, not in a declaration, but in the ordinary warmth of a full table and a held hand, and the particular, unhurried peace of people who have stopped pretending to be smaller than they are. I had spent 11 years learning to be invisible. I spent the rest of my life learning what it meant to be seen. And it turned out, as the truest things tend to, that the two were not so different as I had always believed. That being seen was not exposure. That it was not danger. It was simply and entirely home.